The lantern light was gold against the frost-white window when she pulled her shawl tighter and stepped out into the dark before dawn, breath clouding, boots crunching over packed snow that had not softened in 6 weeks anywhere in Laramie County except the 100 yards of hillside behind her own cabin. 2 winters now. 2 winters, and still the sight of it caught in her chest like a held note. The low glass-topped frames rising from the snowbank like something planted by a kinder season, steam curling faint off the earth beneath them, and inside, rows of lettuce standing green and unbothered, while the rest of the world lay locked in iron cold. Her husband was already at the beds, lantern hung from a post, breath fogging as he lifted crate after crate of pale winter radishes and dark-leafed greens. Packing them in straw the way they'd learned to do so, the greens would ride the miles to Cheyenne without wilting. He straightened when he heard her step, and even after 2 years of mornings like this one, he still looked at the garden the way a man looks at something he cannot quite believe he's allowed to keep. "Wagon's near loaded," he said. "If the road holds, we'll make the hotel by supper." She nodded, but she did not go to the wagon yet. She turned instead toward the cabin door, where a small square of paper hung nailed above the frame, its ink gone soft brown with age, its corners curling from 2 winters of weather. $90. That was the whole of it, the number that had once seemed like a foolish, almost shameful sum to spend on ground that 3 families before them had walked away from in defeat, ground the land agent in Cheyenne had all but begged them to reconsider. She ran her fingers over the paper the way she might touch a scar that had healed well, remembering more than seeing it now. The agent's pitying look, the wind cutting sideways across a bare hilltop that grew nothing but disappointment, the sound of her own voice saying yes before her husband could talk himself out of it. $90 for ground that could not hold a garden through a single killing frost, let alone 3 years running. $90 for a hill the whole county had quietly agreed was cursed. And now crates of green things rode a wagon toward a railroad hotel that paid premium prices for what no other homestead for 50 miles could grow in January. "You're thinking on it again," her husband said, coming up beside her, following her gaze to the deed. "I always think on it," she said, "every time I load a crate." He set his hand over hers against the doorframe, and for a moment neither of them moved, the cold pressing in around them, the lanterns burning low, the seep beneath the hillside doing its slow, the patient work exactly as it had done every day since a January morning nearly 2 years past, a morning when the only thing they owned outright in this world was a worthless hilltop, and the only clue to what it truly held was a strange ring of bare, thawed ground she had noticed in the snow, and could not stop looking at. The cold carried her back the way it always did, past the door, past the deed, past the lanterns, all the way to an October afternoon when the hilltop had worn a different face entirely, brown and wind-burned, the grass beaten flat by 3 summers of hope and 3 autumns of ruin. He had stood beside her that day with his carpenter's hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, studying the collapsed fence line, the sagging remains of a soddy roof, the garden beds gone to weed and stone. The agent called it cursed ground, he'd said, not quite believing it himself. 3 families tried. 3 families lost everything green they planted, first hard frost every single year, same as clockwork. She remembered how he'd looked at her then, waiting for her to talk sense into him, to say what any sensible bride ought to say about spending nearly every dollar they possessed on ground that could not be trusted to hold a garden past September. Instead, she had walked the fence line herself, boots crunching over dead thistle, and turned back to him with an expression he would later say he married her twice over for. "Everyone talks about what this hill can't do," she'd told him. "Nobody's ever told me what killed those gardens. Only that they died." He'd laughed, low and surprised, the way he still did sometimes now, 2 years on. That's not exactly reassuring if we're the ones planting next. But she hadn't backed down, and neither, in the end, had he. They had stood together at the edge of that abandoned claim as the wind came down off the ridge, cold enough to ache in the teeth, and he had finally said what she'd been waiting to hear, that a carpenter knew the difference between wood that was rotten through and wood that only looked ruined on the surface. Maybe ground was the same. Maybe 3 failures didn't prove a fourth was certain. $90. Nearly everything they had carried west in their wagon and saved since their wedding that spring. The land agent had warned them twice. Plainly uneasy taking their money for ground, he seemed to feel guilty selling. "You'll lose your garden by first frost," he'd said, same as the others. They had signed anyway, her hand steady over his on the paper, both of them too young and too stubborn and too in love with the idea of building something entirely their own to listen to sense. That night, in the borrowed lantern light of a cabin that still smelled of the family before them, she had nailed the deed above the door herself, driving the small nail with more determination than skill, declaring it would stay there whether the hill proved them fools or not. Now, standing in that same doorway nearly 2 years later, she thought of how little either of them had understood that autumn evening, how the ground beneath their boots had already been keeping its quiet, patient secret, waiting through another whole winter before a morning in January would finally show her the first thin circle of bare, thawed earth against the snow. She pressed her hand flat against the doorframe now, feeling the grain of wood gone silver with weather, and let herself drift back further still, past that January morning, to the afternoon they had first climbed the hill, with everything they owned stacked crooked in the wagon bed. The road up had been frozen into ruts hard as iron, and the mule had balked twice before the cabin ever came into view. Half fallen, its roof sagging under old snow, one window boarded with a plank gone gray and split. Smoke had never once come from that chimney in the 2 months since the last family had abandoned it, and the ground around it looked no different from any other stretch of that bitter country, white, silent, unpromising. Their nearest neighbor, a weathered widow named for kindness though sharp of tongue, had stood at her own fence line, watching them pass with the particular stillness of someone who has already decided what will happen and is only waiting to be proven right. "Cursed ground," she'd called out, not unkindly, more like a warning passed between women who understood loss. 3 families before you, good people, hard workers, the frost don't care. He had lifted his hat to her all the same, and Clara, no, she caught herself before even thinking the name, though the story asked her not to speak it aloud. She had only smiled and said they meant to find out for themselves. That first night unloading in failing light, hauling crates and trunks up a slope so steep the mule slipped twice, had been harder than either of them let show on their faces. The cabin door hung crooked on one hinge. Snow had drifted through the gap beneath the sill and lay in a thin blue shadow across the floorboards. They had swept it out together with a broom made from bound willow branches, working in silence broken only by breath clouding in the cold. And when the small stove finally caught and held its flame, they had stood close to it without speaking, simply grateful for warmth after a day that had tested every ounce of resolve they carried. It was there, in that first flicker of firelight, that she had driven the nail above the door and hung the deed like a flag claiming ground no one else wanted. He remembered thinking, watching her, that whatever came of the winter ahead, failure or otherwise, he would rather face it beside her on a hill everyone called cursed than prosper anywhere without her. Neither of them could have known then how true that thought would prove, nor how soon the hill itself would begin, quietly and without ceremony, to answer the question the whole valley believed already settled. The wagon came up the frozen track just after midday, its runners grinding against packed snow, and she heard it before she saw it, that particular creak of cold wood under weight, the huff of a tired horse. She set down the basket she was carrying and shaded her eyes against the glare off the white fields below. It was the family from the eastern quarter section, the ones who had watched all winter with narrowed, doubtful eyes as crates left the hilltop twice a week bound for Cheyenne. The husband climbed down first, stiff in his movements, his breath fogging thick around a face reddened by wind. His wife followed, bundled to the chin, holding the hand of a young boy who stared up at the low glass frame of the cold house as though it might be some trick of the light. "We heard talk in town," the husband said, without much preamble, stamping snow from his boots. "Heard you're pulling lettuce out of the ground, same as if it were June." He said it plainly, not unkindly, but with the flat suspicion of a man who had buried too many seasons of his own labor beneath frost to trust in easy answers. "Our fields are locked solid. Ground rings like iron when you strike it. I'd like to know how a body grows anything at all up here, let alone sells it." She felt the old familiar flicker of pride and caution both. Pride that the work spoke loud enough to reach the valley floor. Caution because she and her husband had learned, hard won, that wonders shown too quickly bred more doubt than belief. She glanced toward the barn, where he was still finishing the last of the day's chores, forking hay for the mule, checking the water trough for skim ice. "We've chores yet to close out the day," she told them, drawing her shawl tighter, meeting the husband's eyes steadily. "But once they're done, I'll walk you up past the beds myself. You'll see plain enough. There's no trick to it, only ground that don't freeze where the rest of the counties does." She said it simply, the way she might state the weather, though she felt the old thrill of it still, 2 years on, the private wonder that had never quite worn to ordinary. The wife's eyes moved from the frost-white fields behind her to the strange, dark soil visible even now through gaps in the snow along the north slope, steaming faintly in the cold air. The boy tugged his mother's sleeve, pointing. "That there," he said, "that there's smoke." "It's not smoke," she told him gently. "It's warmth, coming up out of the ground itself. You'll see." The husband said nothing more, only nodded once, arms crossed, clearly resolved to withhold judgment until his own eyes confirmed or denied what his ears had carried up the hill. She turned back toward the cabin, feeling the old deed nailed above the door catch the pale afternoon light, and thought, not for the first time, how strange it was that disbelief always arrived first, and wonder only after, once the ground itself was allowed to speak. She led the visiting family toward the smokeless steam rising off the slope, but her mind had already slipped backward, the way it so often did on cold afternoons, back to that January 2 winters gone, when the same white breath of ground had first caught her eye. That January had been a trial of its own kind, separate from the wonder that followed. The well behind the cabin had frozen solid by the second week, its ropes stiff as iron, and every morning began the same way, breaking ice with the flat of a hatchet, hauling buckets up the frozen slope one aching step at a time, her shawl crusted white by the time she reached the door. Her husband split kindling until his hands cracked at the knuckles, and still the cold pressed in through every seam of the cabin walls. She recalled thinking, more than once, that they had traded $90 for a slow kind of suffering, dressed up as a homestead. It was on one of those water-hauling mornings, half blind with cold and tired in her bones, that she first noticed it, a ring of bare earth showing dark against the snow along the north slope, no bigger across than a wagon wheel, steam curling faintly off it into the gray air. She had stopped mid-stride, buckets swinging, certain at first her eyes deceived her, but the next morning it was there again, in the very same place, and a smaller ring besides, a little further down the hill. She said nothing to her husband for 2 days, turning it over privately, half suspecting some trick of shadow or her own weary mind. But on the third morning, hauling water past the frozen garden beds, she counted 4 such rings, always fixed in place, never drifting with the wind-blown snow the way ordinary melt would. She stood a long while in the bitter air, watching faint threads of steam rise and vanish, and felt something quicken in her chest that was not the cold. That evening, by the low fire, she told him plainly what she'd seen. Not fancy, not fright, just fact, laid out the way she might report a broken axle or a leaning fence post. He listened with the particular stillness he kept for things he did not yet believe, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "Snow melts uneven all the time," he said, though his voice carried less certainty than his words. "Not in rings," she answered. Not in the same rings, morning after morning, with the whole county froze solid around them. He said nothing more that night, but she saw him glance toward the window before he banked the fire, out toward the pale slope silvered with moonlight and snow. And she lay awake long after his breathing had steadied beside her, thinking of those small dark circles in the white, patient and unchanging, as though the hill itself were trying, in its own quiet way, to tell them something they had not yet learned to hear. Now, 2 winters gone by, she can stand at that same window and watch the steam rise without her heart catching in her throat. But she still remembers how it felt the morning he finally took the spade to the ground. He'd waited 3 days after she told him, 3 days of pretending the matter had settled itself into ordinary explanation. But she knew him well enough to see the way his eyes kept drifting to the north slope while he split kindling, the way he lingered over his coffee each morning a little longer than before. On the 4th day, before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, he pulled on his boots and took up the spade without a word, and she followed him out into air, so cold it seemed to crack against her cheeks. He walked the line of bare circles until he found the one nearest the fissure of gray rock jutting from the hillside, and there he began to dig. The ground gave easier than it should have. Not the iron-hard resistance of frozen earth, but something softer, looser, faintly yielding beneath the crust of frost. She stood close, her breath fogging in quick, short bursts, watching the blade turn up soil that grew darker and damper with each stroke, until at last it struck something that was not soil at all. Water, not a spring bursting forth, nothing so grand as that, but a thin skin of it, threading low through a shallow channel no wider than her hand, seeping down from some hidden seam in the rock above. He knelt and touched it with 2 bare fingers, and his face changed. Not surprise exactly, but the particular look of a man revising everything he thought he understood in the space of a single breath. "It's warm," he said, and there was wonder plain in his voice now, all the doubt gone out of it. Not hot, but warm. He cupped a little in his palm and held it up, as though she might not believe him unless she felt it herself, and she knelt beside him in the snow and let the water run cool warm across her fingers, steaming faint and silver in the freezing air. It was nothing that could fill a washtub, nothing that could ever warm a bath or a kettle worth speaking of, but it did not need to be. It only needed to keep moving, thin and steady, threading its patient way beneath the snow, holding back the killing frost that had beaten 3 families before them. They knelt there together a long while, saying little, watching the water find its own slow path downhill through the disturbed earth, and she thought of the deed nailed above their door, of the $90 they could not truly spare, of the land agent's warning voice, and wondered, for the first time since they'd signed their names to that worthless hill, whether they had been fools after all, or simply the first to look closely enough to see what had been waiting there all along. Winter had come again to Laramie County, and she stood on the north slope with snow crusting the hem of her skirt, pointing down at a ring of bare brown earth no larger than a washtub, steam curling off it thin as breath. "There," she said, "and there. You'll see 3 more before we reach the fence line." Beside her, the neighbor woman, young, red-cheeked, her husband trailing a few steps behind with a spade over his shoulder, bent low to look, the way she herself had bent low 2 winters past, not believing what her own eyes told her. "It looks no different than any other patch of ground," the young wife said. "That's what I thought too. Snow everywhere else, thick as a feather tick, and then these bare circles, always in the same places, year after year. I hauled water past this very spot a dozen times before I stopped to wonder why." She could still feel it, if she let herself, the cold bucket handle biting her palms, the ache in her shoulders, and beneath it all, that small itch of curiosity that would not let her walk on by. It seemed a lifetime ago now, and no time at all. "My husband thought I'd gone soft in the head, telling him to bring a shovel out in January," she went on, and the neighbor woman laughed, a puff of white breath in the cold air. "But he dug anyway. Found water beneath, not hot, mind you, just warm enough not to freeze, steady enough to matter." She led them further along the slope, her boots finding the same path they always found now, worn smooth by 2 years of walking it in every season. The neighbor's husband crouched at the next ring, laid his bare hand flat against the thawed earth, and went still. "Well, I'll be," he murmured. "That's near what my husband said," she told him, smiling, "only with more feeling behind it." She showed them where the fissure opened higher on the hillside, how the seep threaded down through the disturbed ground even now, hidden beneath the drifts, faithful as a clock. She told them how they'd tested its flow with buckets first, then carved wood gutters, watching where the water wanted to go before ever cutting a trench to tell it otherwise. She told them about the clay lining, packed tight as a jar seal so the warmth wouldn't bleed away into the frozen soil before it reached the beds. It wasn't luck, she said, quieter now, watching the young wife's face carefully. It was looking hard at something everyone else walked past. That's all it ever was. The neighbor's husband straightened, brushing snow from his knees, his eyes following the line of bare rings down toward the cabin, the cold frame glass glinting faint in the winter light. "Show us where to dig," he said. "We'll bring the wagon up Thursday." She nodded, already turning to lead them on, already thinking of the trench lines they'd need to lay before the ground hardened further, and of how strange it still felt, some mornings, to be the one teaching now, instead of the one kneeling in the snow, uncertain, hoping. The snow crunched under their boots as she led the neighbors down toward the frame, but her mind slipped backward, the way it did so often now, back to that first February when the seep was still a secret between just the two of them, unproven, unnamed. He had knelt for hours at the fisher's mouth with a tin bucket, catching what trickled out drop by patient drop, timing it against the stub of a candle he'd marked with notches. "Faint," he'd said, shaking his head at the shallow inch gathered after an hour. "Won't fill a trough by supper, But faint wasn't nothing, she'd reminded him, and they'd carried that bucket down the slope again and again, pouring it over bare patches to see how far the warmth would travel before the frost swallowed it whole. It hadn't traveled far. 6 inches, maybe 8, before the ground turned hard and unyielding again. So they'd tried the carved gutters next, strips of scrap pine, hollowed with his chisel, laid end to end like a child's toy aqueduct, propped on stones to keep the pitch even. He'd shaved each channel by lantern light in the barn, while she held the wood steady, both of them arguing gently over the angle, over how much fall the water needed to keep moving without freezing solid in the troughs overnight. The first 2 nights it froze anyway, a thin skin of ice sealing the gutters shut by morning, and they'd stood over the ruin of their work with cold hands and colder breath, saying nothing, only looking at each other with the particular exhaustion of people who refuse to quit. "It wants a steadier bed," she'd finally said, "something that holds the warmth instead of losing it to the wood." That was the morning they'd walked the creek bank searching for clay, digging through crusted snow with their fingers half numb, testing the ground until they found a seam soft enough to work. Weeks that had taken, not days, weeks of hauling buckets and adjusting gutters and watching, always watching, where the water wanted to go before ever telling it otherwise. She remembered the ache in her shoulders from the yoke, the way his hands had cracked and bled a little at the knuckles from working frozen wood, the quiet meals eaten fast so they could get back out before dark. But it had taught them the seep's temperament, patient, shallow, constant, long before they'd cut a single trench in earnest. And now, walking this same slope with strangers trailing behind her, she understood what she hadn't back then, that all those cold, fumbling weeks with buckets and gutters hadn't been delay at all. They'd been the real discovery. The digging came after. The seeing came first. The trenching itself had come slower than either of them expected, though she supposed everything worthwhile on that hill had taught them the same lesson twice. They cut the channels by hand, following the clay seam they'd found along the creek, packing it thick against the raw earth, so the warmth from the seep wouldn't bleed away into the frozen ground around it. He worked the trench lines with a spade that had belonged to his father, and she followed behind him, smoothing the clay with the flat of a broken shingle, pressing it firm the way her own mother had once pressed dough, steady, unhurried, trusting the material to hold if she gave it the attention it wanted. The beds went in above the channels, raised on old fence rails they'd pulled from a collapsed corral 3 claims over, no one minding the taking since the claims themselves had long since emptied, but it was the cold house that tested them most. He wanted it low and close to the ground, arguing the wind would tear anything taller apart before February finished with them. She wanted glass enough to let the sun do its share of the work, and they went back and forth over it for the better part of a week, standing in the snow pointing at freight crates like 2 carpenters disputing a cathedral. In the end, they built it his height and her light, low walls of scrap lumber banked with earth, and along the south face, glass salvaged from a dozen mismatched crates the railroad had no more use for, cracked corners patched with tar paper, frames shimmed level with wedges of pine. It wasn't handsome. It listed faintly to the east, and the door never did hang quite true, but when they lit no fire inside it at all, and the thermometer she'd nailed to the frame still held above freezing come morning, they stood together in the gray dawn light, not saying anything, because there wasn't yet a way to say it that matched what it felt like. It held. That was all. It held the warmth the seep gave it, the way the trenches held the water, the way the clay held its shape against frost that had beaten 3 families off that same ground before them. She remembered reaching for his hand without looking, the two of them watching their breath cloud in air that, just beyond the glass, was killing everything it touched, and inside, impossibly, green things beginning to lift their heads toward a sun they had no right to trust yet. Now, in the winter of 1885, the cold house had grown a second life she never planned for, a schoolroom of sorts, though the only lessons taught were of clay and water and patience. The neighbor wife knelt beside her in the narrow bed, sleeves pushed to the elbow, hands slick with the same gray clay that had once seemed to Clara like nothing more than stubborn mud. "You want it smooth as a plate," she told the woman, pressing her palm along the trench wall to show how the clay should curve without a seam for water to slip through. "Any gap, and the seep finds it. It's patient that way, patient as anything." The neighbor wife laughed, low and warm, a sound that filled the glass-walled space alongside the smell of turned earth and green growing things. "Patient. Same as you were, I suppose, waiting on your husband to believe you about the snow rings. He believed quick enough once he saw them himself." She smiled, smoothing another stretch of clay. "Men need convincing with their own eyes sometimes. Yours is out there now, doing just that." Through the frost-rimmed glass, she could see the men crouched at the head of the neighbor family's own slope, a quarter-mile off but visible in the low winter light, her husband gesturing at some invisible line of fall, some angle of descent only he and the water seemed to understand. Voices carried faint across the cold, argument and agreement, tangled together the way they always were, between men measuring something they couldn't yet see the shape of. "Cut it steeper there," she heard him call, "or she'll pool before she ever reaches your beds." The neighbor's husband said something back she couldn't catch, and both men laughed. An easy sound, the kind that came only after enough winters of trusting one another's judgment. Inside, the neighbor wife pressed her own palm flat against the clay, testing it the way Clara had shown her, and her face changed with something like wonder. "It's warm," she said, "even here, before the water's even run." "That's the ground beneath remembering," Clara said. "Once it's held warmth a season, it never quite forgets how." They worked in a companionable quiet after that, two women shaping earth by lamplight, while the greens along the beds behind them lifted pale and stubborn toward the glass, and outside the men's voices rose and fell against the wind, measuring, arguing, believing. It struck her, watching the neighbor wife's hands grow surer with every pass of clay, how much of what they'd built here wasn't only the trenches or the frames or the seep itself, but this, the passing of it, hand to hand, family to family, until the whole hillside might learn to hold its own warmth against a cold that no longer had to win. She thought back, as she often did in these quiet, lamplit hours, to that first March, the one that had made all the rest of it possible. He had come in from the cold house with his coat still buttoned, snow melting in his hair, holding his hat like a bowl in both hands. Inside it, pale and impossibly tender, lay the season's first lettuce, its leaves curled loose and green against the felt, and beside it, a fist of radishes still crumbed with dark, thawed earth. She had not believed it at first. Through the frost-glazed window she could see the valley beyond their fence, stretching white and locked, the Palmers' fields still buried under drifts, smoke standing straight up from every chimney in sight because no one dared open a door longer than needed. And yet here, on the hill everyone said was cursed, they were cutting greens. "Taste it," he'd said, holding one out to her, and she had, standing there in her apron with flour on her hands, and it was sweet and slightly peppered and utterly real. They packed the first crate together at the kitchen table 2 days later, wrapping each head in damp cloth, the way the Cheyenne hotel man's letter had instructed, though neither of them quite trusted yet that anyone would pay real money for green things in the dead of winter. The letter had come back faster than either of them expected, written in a clerk's careful hand. The hotel would take all they could send, at a premium, so long as it kept coming steady through the cold months, when their usual suppliers along the rail line had nothing at all. She remembered reading that line aloud twice, her voice catching the second time, and how he had set down his coffee and simply looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to hold the whole shape of what they'd built inside his eyes before speaking. $90, he said finally, low, almost disbelieving. $90 and 3 failed families. And now a hotel in Cheyenne wants what we're growing on ground nobody else could touch. She hadn't answered right away. She'd only walked to the door, touched the edge of the deed nailed above it, its paper already softening at the corners from months of steam and wood smoke, and thought of the bare rings in the snow that had started it all. Small, patient, easy to miss unless you were looking with the right kind of hope. Now, years later, guiding the neighbor wife's hand along a fresh trench wall, she felt that same hope moving outward, past their own fence line, the way water moved once you gave it somewhere true to go. The wagon came up the frozen track that same afternoon, its bed already lined with crates of lettuce so pale and tender it seemed wrong for winter to hold it, and she counted them the way she always did, twice, before the driver latched the gate and turned the team toward Cheyenne. Twice a week now, rain or hard frost or wind that scoured the hilltop raw, the wagon made that same climb and that same descent, and twice a week the hotel's kitchen sent back word of how the guests marveled at radishes in January as though someone had played a trick on the season itself. There was no trick, only water finding its way where they had asked it to go, patient and unglamorous, the way most true things were. Below the north slope, the neighbor families had their own trenches dug now, clay-packed and steaming faintly in the cold morning air, their beds greening under salvaged glass, just as the first ones had. She had shown the wife how to test the flow with a carved gutter before committing the shovel, just as he had taught her once, and the husband had shaken her own husband's hand out by the fence line, saying he still could hardly credit that the worst ground in the county had turned out to be the best. That evening, with the crates gone and the lamps lit low against the early dark, she took down the deed from above the door, the paper soft now, the ink gone the color of weak tea, and pressed it flat again before driving the nail back through its worn corner into the wood. $90, she thought, tracing the number with one finger. $90 and 3 men's failures, and a bit of steam rising in a ring on the snow that nobody else had thought to kneel down and look at twice. He came to stand behind her, resting a hand on her shoulder, watching the deed settle back into its old place above the door, where it had hung through every season since. They called this hill worthless, he said quietly, the words unhurried, the way a man speaks when he has waited a long while to say something true. 3 families proved it, near enough. But it isn't sleeping now, and it never will again. Not while that water keeps coming down from the rock, and not while there's someone willing to trench for it. She leaned back against him, watching the lamplight catch the nail-head, the paper, the whole small history of their patience nailed there for anyone to see. Outside, the wind moved over the frozen valley, but beneath the snow, steady and unseen, the hillside kept its quiet, faithful